Buenas tardes con todos. Agradecemos su participación en nuestra siguiente fecha de la serie de webinars de 2021. Estos webinars son desarrollados mensualmente en cooperación con 3 instituciones universitarias nacionales. Tenemos a la Universidad Nacional Herminio Valdizán de Huánuco, la Universidad Nacional San Antonio Abad del Cusco y la Universidad Nacional de la Amazonía de Iquitos. En esta oportunidad, el webinar titulado Interactions between Tributary Creeks and Main Channels in Estuaries presentará los resultados de 2 estudios de campos muy interesantes que investigan las interacciones entre arroyos tributarios y el canal principal de redes en los cauces en las marismas. Esta ponencia es brindada por los investigadores y candidatos a doctor Adrián García y Colin Hortals. Adrián García es becario de investigación de posgrado en el programa conjunto entre el MIT y el Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, con un enfoque de investigación en mecánica de fluidos ambientales en la zona costera. Colin Hortals es candidato a doctorado en el Departamento de Ingeniería Costera de la Universidad de Florida, en los Estados Unidos, con un énfasis de investigación sobre evolución geoespacial de las marismas y distribución y abundancia de plantas y animales. Ambos son graduados de la Universidad de Pittsburgh en el 2016 con bachiller en Ingeniería Civil. Asimismo, este evento está siendo transmitido en vivo vía Zoom y a través de nuestro Facebook, además de los canales de las universidades organizadoras. Posteriormente, esta grabación también se subirá a nuestro canal de YouTube. Recuerden que los que están conectados por plataforma Zoom tienen acceso al servicio de interpretación que pueden encontrar en la parte inferior del panel. Cualquier consulta o duda que surja durante la ponencia, por favor escribirlas en la sección de preguntas y respuestas en el Zoom o también en la sección de comentarios para quienes nos sigan vía Facebook. Estas preguntas serán respondidas al final del webinar. Siéntanse libres de comentar en cualquier momento y al final podremos responder las preguntas. So, many thanks Adrian and Colby for giving us your keynote lecture. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I'm pretty sure we will learn a lot today, and I know everybody's waiting for you. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am going to share screen now. Sorry. Okay. Okay, everyone can see the screen. Okay. All right. So hi everyone, my name is Adrian. I'll be starting off today's webinar series, and I'll be talking about some fieldwork. And this is work that was recently published, and I will have a QR code at the end if you want to take a look at the paper. It is open access, so anyone can read it. This is work, fieldwork I did in with my advisor, Rocky Geyer, as well as a summer student, Noah Randall, who is now working in the USGS. And this picture, this drone image, sort of gives some indication into the type of work I'll be presenting today. So I'll be talking about estuaries, which are where the river meets the ocean. And these are incredibly dynamic ecosystems which provide a number of services. For example, the channel is often used for transportation, and many cities build their ports on estuaries because it provides this open connection both upstream as well as to the ocean. These areas are also popular for recreation and other uses such as fishing because of the unique ecosystems they provide. And these are in fact many oftentimes critical habitats. Lots of fish spawn in these estuaries because of the unique physical and biogeochemical conditions that are available in these environments. Now, the definition of an estuary is sort of set by, how far up does the salt from the ocean get into the river? And that really has a lot of consequences for a number of things. So for one, it can be used as a habitat indicator because there are not that, for example, there are not that many species of vegetation which can survive under, which have high tolerance to salt. So only, marsh grasses, seagrasses, and mangroves essentially are able to live in a brackish or salty environment. Additionally, the intrusion of salt into an estuary can also limit the availability of freshwater upstream. So if you're drawing water from the river and you're now drawing water from a salty river, you no longer have potable water. And this has huge consequences both for municipal as well as agricultural use. And the dynamics that control, how far up the salt reaches are also impacted by changes in channel morphology and forcing conditions. And this is going to be something that will change as humans continue to live in and interact with these types of ecosystems. So as we dredge canals, as we build bridges, as we try to do restoration projects, all of these things are going to have consequences on the estuary dynamics. So what exactly what are the physics which control the salinity intrusion? So here's a schematic which shows the dynamics of an estuary in a simplified sense, at least. And on this side, we have the river, which provides fresh water and also a constant seaward flow. And then on the other end, we have the ocean, which provides which affects the estuary strongly through tides, and which create oscillatory currents that induce turbulent mixing. And this all plays out in the morphology of the estuary, which could have meanders, it could have shoals, it can have constrictions and expansions, and all of these things can contribute to lateral variations in circulation pattern, secondary circulation, much as if you're familiar with helical flow and a meander, as well as local flow asymmetry. Now, the distribution of salt in an estuary, or the salinity distribution, is dictated by the salt balance, which in a simplified sense, you have the river, which is always flowing outwards. And then you have a number of processes which we can characterize as under the broad term of dispersion. And often this is written in an equation, something like this, where we have QF, the river flow, times the salinity, and it's at some location in the estuary, and it's equal to dispersion coefficient times the horizontal salinity gradient times the area. And so this is just a way that we sort of wrap our minds around this sort of topic. So what I set out to do was with my advisor as well as some others is to study. We looked at the North River, which is a salt marsh estuary in Massachusetts, and we wanted to see how much does lateral exchange with creeks contribute to dispersion. So how much this exchange mechanism with the creeks how does that contribute to increasing the salinity, ultimately to increasing the salinity intrusion in the estuary. And this is showing a schematic of the lateral exchange, or what's often called tidal trapping. I'll probably refer to it as in this way often with a creek. So during flood tide, salty water from the ocean. So here red is saltier water and white is fresh water. And so there's a gradient from white to red, so it's from fresh to salty. So this salt water from the ocean propagates into the estuary, and as the flood tide continues, it'll continue propagating up the estuary, and it'll also begin filling in the creek. However, due to differences in geometry between the main channel and the creek, Often the creeks have a shorter geometry, so the phasing is more like a standing wave, whereas the phasing in between the tidal phasing in an estuary main channel is partially progressive. But because of this phase difference, the currents in the creek will tend to reverse earlier than the main channel. So while the main channel is still flooding, the creek has already began to ebb and empty out back into the main channel. And because of this sort of time offset, it'll continue to sort of lead the main channel, and as a result, it'll return fresher water back into the main channel. And so this is the process of tidal trapping, and it perhaps is not clear how this contributes right away to dispersion. And so next we'll take a look at what I mean by tidal dispersion. So this is here I'm talking about the tidal salt flux, which is the tidal correlation between the velocity and salinity at some location. And if under certain circumstances, this can result in a net non-zero salt flux. So I'll show first a case where there's zero net salt flux, which is where, say, you have flood tide. So this is black is velocity, red is salinity. And during flood tide, the salinity just increases from fresh to salty. And during ebb tide, the salinity decreases from salty to fresh. And if you multiply velocity and salinity, and then you take the average over time, we get this. So first, if we multiply them, we get the solid line. And then if we take the average, it's this dashed line, which is equal to 0. And this is the case if you have basically velocity and salinity in perfect quadrature, which is basically a sine and a cosine. In the case that, say for example, so the salinity signal was shifted in time, say earlier, then you see that it's essentially mathematically we're shifting one of the sinusoids earlier in time, and so when you take the average, because they're out of quadrature, you get a non-zero value. Now, in the case of tidal trapping, what we find is that if we're at some location in the main channel affected by the creek, during the early ebb tide, you'd get this drop in salinity because the creek is fresher than the main channel, and so you get a salinity deficit. And now you see when we multiply the two, we have again we have a non-zero net salt flux. So this is sort of the mathematical way that we want to study this. Now, research on the tidal trapping mechanism has gone back a long time ago. The first paper I found was from 1953, looking at this mechanism in Dutch estuaries. The classic paper in estuarine literature is by Okubo, who created a parametrization. And then later, McVean and Stacy in 2011 developed another parametrization, which they argued works better for side channels as opposed to just like some broad shoals. And so my work builds upon these previous results by using high resolution field measurements to test these parametrizations. And not only that, but to provide a mechanistic understanding of the tidal trapping mechanism. And this work was recently published in Estuaries and Coast, and it's open access, so please take a look if you're interested. So again, my objective here is to measure and quantify the impact of tidal trapping in these tributary creeks on the main channel. So this is just showing the sort of study site, and we aim to study this using a number of different field methods. So one, we had shipboard measurements where we had a shipboard ADCP, and we also took CTD casts across the channel and along the creeks. We have aerial imagery from drones, and we also have a set of moored instruments. But for the focus of this talk, I'm just gonna, I'll just be talking about the shipboard measurements and the drone images. So here, we'll start with the drone image because this is the coolest part of my talk. So if you had to pay attention to one thing, it would be this slide because it really shows you what I'm talking about. So here we have, so you can see this is the drone image is sort of rotated. So it's about almost 90 degrees from north So north is to the right here. But here on the left side of the image, you see the creek outflow. This is during early ebb tide, and the main channel is here, kind of flowing downwards. And you can see that very clearly that there's distinct differences between, there's distinct color differences between the creek and the main channel. And this really provides an excellent visualization of the trapping mechanism, because we can see this really stark contrast between the water coming out of the creek and what's in the main channel. And we put a couple of drifters in the water. Those are those white dots. I forgot to edit these arrows. These are not where the buoys are. These are the buoys. So this is just, so this is an excellent visualization. But in order to actually quantify the dispersion, we need to look at our shipboard surveys. And we really want to know how much do the creeks actually reduce the salinity in the channel. So we see that it's got these different properties than the main channel, but we want to quantify it. And so what I'm showing here, so this is these are contours of the cross-section average salinity from the shipboard surveys along this reach from 9, transects 9 through 1. So each of these dots is a survey at a cross-section in the main channel. And to think about this, so this is in X space. So this is sort of along the channel in this direction and through time in this dimension. So this is a time-space plot of salinity. And you can see, there's this sort of disruption in what we would have expected, in the salinity contours. And that results from the interaction of the creeks. There's 2 creeks, Stony Brook and Cove Brook, which intersect the main channel at this location and this location. You can see that during the ebb tide, so as the salty water is now exiting the estuary, we see that the creeks join in and they also affect it. So what I want to know is, what's the salinity deficit caused by by the creeks? And in order to do that, I had to estimate the background salinity in the absence of creeks. And the way I did that was to basically use this the salinity measurements at the upstream most transect as a boundary condition, and then use the advection equation to effectively create a background salinity in the absence of creeks. So the idea is that if there were no creeks in the estuary or in the system, then this is what the salinity evolution would look like in space and time. Well, when we subtract these two, we get delta S, which is the salinity deficit caused by the creek. So we can see these sort of big blue spots sort of during early ebb around hour 13. And so they come in, they enter the main channel, and then they get advected downstream with the currents. And this is really showing how, so this is how we can sort of quantify, what exactly is the effect of the creeks on the main channel. And so then when we come back and look, go to one of those cross sections, and we calculate we can now calculate the tidal salt flux from the tidal correlation, just from here. And what we find is the dispersion is actually larger than what was predicted by theoretical estimates. And so one of the reasons for this is that these previous studies have considered the trap to be vertically well mixed, and that allowed them to simplify the kinematics that they use to create their parametrizations. But what we find actually is that they're not well mixed, and I'll show you that next. So in fact, we find that water gets stratified in the creeks. So this is showing a long channel profile of salinity in the creeks and Cove Brook. So that's if we were to go along this little creek here. And then here is the cross section in North River. So that's just across the North River. So just imagine if we were to go from here to here, it would be going from across the North River and then into the creek. So this is during a late flood, towards the end of flood, where water from the North River is filling up the creek. And you can see that the water from the North River, the main channel, is fairly well mixed, and it's fairly well mixed when it enters the creek. But if you look upstream, it's actually pretty stratified. In fact, as we continue through the tide, so just going to the next time here, it gets even, we see it's even more stratified in the creeks. And as the ebb tide progresses, now the creek is emptying out into the main channel, and it's very stratified. And one of the consequences of this stratification is we get even fresher water leaving the creek and entering the main channel. And so the fact that the salinity contrast between what's coming out of the creek and what's in the main channel is enhanced by the stratification means that the dispersion has to be larger in the main channel. This continues to mid-ebb, where we continue to see really strong contrast between the water coming out from the creek and the water in the main channel. The next question, of course, is, well, why is the creek so stratified? Especially, we found that in general, the main channel is well mixed everywhere except for where the creeks join into it. And so to answer that, we have to look at the kinematics, and it turns out one big reason for this stratification is the fact that the currents, the tidal currents in the creek are much smaller than the tidal currents in the main channel. Now, the reason that's important is because the creeks inherit the salinity gradient of the main channel during flood tide because of their boundary. They have a boundary with the main channel. But because the velocity in the creek is much smaller, that means we need to have a much larger dsdx, salinity gradient in the creek to correspond to satisfy this boundary condition here. And so the important thing about this is that so basically this advective term in the main channel has to equal the advective term in the creek. And since velocity in the creek is much smaller than velocity in the main channel, that means the axial salinity gradient has to be much larger in the creek. And the important thing about this is that stratification is caused by density-driven exchange flows, which are driven by this salinity gradient, and it's reduced by turbulent mixing. This density-driven flow, or baroclinic, which is driven by the baroclinic pressure gradient, can be compared with turbulent mixing in what is called the Simpson number in Estuarian literature. And larger values of SI indicate stronger stratification. So this is a non-dimensional number. And in fact, we find in the North River, we have a much smaller Simpson number than in the creek. And so we find that it's really because the smaller velocities in the creek, one, create a much larger dsdx in the creek, and two, make a much smaller, much weaker turbulent mixing. So in summary, I found that the dispersion due to tidal trapping in the North River is larger than predicted by theory based on our empirical analysis. And the weaker currents and the strong along axis salinity gradients in the creek generate stratification, which we find is caused by an exchange flow that enhances the salinity contrast between the creek outflow and the main channel. And this ultimately is the reason why we find larger tidal dispersion than predicted by theory. So just some thanks, especially to my advisor, Rocky, up here, as well as Noah, who is a summer student I worked with a lot at summer, as well as field assistants from others at Woods Hole, Dave, Peter, Water, and Jay. And this, I guess we'll take questions at the end, but if any of you are interested, here's the QR code to access the paper if you're interested in reading more. It is, again, open access, so anyone should be able to read it. And with that said, I think I'm just on time. So I will now pass it off to Colin, who is a good friend of mine. And sometimes when you're stuck in the field and you're stuck in the mud, it's really great to have a good buddy. So it's the same thing for a presentation, and I am extremely happy to pass the mic to my friend and colleague, Colin.
All right, let's see, get my screen started here. So thank you, Adrian, for the very nice talk and the nice introduction with us in the field. So as a continuation of the talk, this is the interactions between tributary creeks, main channels, part 2. And this work was completed by myself, Orlando Cordero, who's another student in my lab, Arnoldo Valle Levinson, who is a coastal engineering professor at the University of Florida, and Christina Angelini, who's my PhD advisor and a professor in the coastal engineering and environmental engineering department. And really, this work couldn't have happened without the Center for Coastal Solutions, which is headed up by my advisor. It was funded by NSF and the Georgia Coastal Ecosystem Project, and we had a lot of support from the Marine Institute at the University of Georgia. So to continue, let me see here. So today I'm going to be talking about marshes. So Adrian was talking kind of these larger channels. I'm talking about channels that terminate in the marsh platform. So you can see an example right here from a drone image of creeks that are going into the marsh. But before we get there, we just want to cover, like, why do we care about marshes? Why is it important to us? So here's a global map from 1997 showing the extent of salt marshes and mangrove swamps. And I think a lot of the people in this talk are somewhere around here in this circle in Peru. And then my work is completed up here in Georgia and Florida. But as Adrian was talking about, those marshes and estuaries provide a lot of ecological and economic services. So, for example, marshes, they sequester carbon, they cycle nitrogen, and they provide a habitat for animals. So they have very biodiverse, they're very biodiverse regions. And furthermore, if you have a hurricane or something, or storm surge coming into the coast, they can reduce the energy and dissipate the energy and lessen the damage. So I just want to show a quick video that I took with a drone of the area, just to give everybody a sense of what this site looks like. So this is taken along the Georgia coast in the US, somewhat nearby my study site, but it's mostly just to give you an overview, the sense of scale and how things look. So the marshes here are dominated by a grass called Spartina alterniflora. It's like 95% of the coverage that you'll see here. And you see these large main channel features, and then you see these small creeks that go and terminate within the marsh platform. And the scale of creeks that I'm talking about are about 10 meters wide or less. So this creek, for example, I think is only about 2 or 3 meters wide. And right away from the video, what you can see is some pretty interesting things surrounding the creek feature. If you look out on the platform where my arrow is, things look pretty homogeneous. The surface looks pretty similar. But as you get into the creek feature, you can see the grass is clearly different. So the grass is higher here. And you see hundreds of little mounds here, which is mussel mounds, which enhance vegetation growth. And also mudflat features, which are caused by burrowing crabs. And I'll just speed ahead a little bit just to show there's me stuck on a sandbar for like 2 hours. And there's a couple more creeks that we can look at. And so this is just to give you a sense of the kind of features I'm going to be talking about here as we go on. So I'll exit out of this and continue. So as I was saying, why they're important, they provide a lot of ecological and economic services to us. And this is a photo from the field site. And there's a lot of heterogeneity at these creeks. So oftentimes we think of marshes as these big blobs, big platforms, but in reality, when you get there on the ground, within 100-meter zone, you can see quite a change in vegetation patterns, the distribution of animals, and the elevations. So one thing I want to point out here from another drone image, talking about the biodiversity. So you can see these features that look like spidering webs throughout the marsh. So these mudflats are caused by the interaction of the flow, removing sediments that are getting removed by these Sesarma reticulatum, which is a crab very prevalent along the Atlantic coast. And as I said before, you can see these kind of dots all over the place. And this is caused by the rib mussel. So they aggregate at the creek heads where they have high concentrations of sediments in the water. They're filter feeders, and then they increase the productivity of the Spartina. So there's a very beneficial feedback with these mussels. And just one last zoom to give some more context. You can see how dynamic this kind of environment is. So here's a little walking path from people over time. But this very large feature is basically caused by the interaction of this crab removing vegetation and burrowing, which you can see all over, and the flow removing these sediments. So typically, when we think of salt marsh flooding in like the classical sense or the most rudimentary sense, we think of it as water that comes in through the creeks at the early flood tide. So this is a schematic from Fogarazzi et al. 2013. And as we click through the tide right here, we can see in the beginning, you only have flooding through the creeks. As time progresses, you have flooding over the banks as well. And then at some point, the tide is going to reverse. And later on, it will only exit through the creeks. And to give you a sense of what that kind of looks like on the field, at least during the ebb when it's going through the creeks, I have another quick video to share. In one of these creeks that's ebbing. So this is at a point where all the flow has exited off the platform and it's concentrated only through the creeks. So you can see it moving quite rapidly, and then this green color in there, if it's showing up, is dye, like a tracer, similar to how Adrian was showing with these plates. I'll just skip along a little bit just so you get a sense of what it looks like. And then everything goes out into the main channel here. And then you can see us on our boat here. So with that being said, there's some research gaps in these kind of marsh flows and these models that are used to predict the long-term evolution that we were kind of interested in. So there's papers from before Boone 1975, but that's a pretty good starting point where they were concerned with measuring and modeling tidal asymmetry. And there's some key assumptions in their work. They consider the water surface is flat across the marsh. So everything is flat no matter where you are. There's no slope at all. The system is frictionless. So that means that if the water enters the edge of the marsh, it arrives to the back of the marsh instantly. And then all flow flows through the channel cross section. So there's no overbank flow at any point. And some work following this was from French and Stoddard, 1992, where they did a field study, and they found that actually the overbank flow can account for up to 60% of the water budget. So it's quite a significant amount of the water budget that's not captured. And furthermore, Torres et al. 2007 conducted a field study in South Carolina marsh. And what they found is the creeks themselves, these small creeks that it was showing, they interact with one another on the intermediate and spring tides quite frequently. And what that means is the behavior is not very well defined in a sense where you have a river that's in a valley, a mountain valley, and it's a very clear drainage divide. And that's one concept that has been applied to marshes, but they found that it may not be the best assumption. And lastly, Fogarazzi, they developed a very nice model that was adapted from Boone's model, but basically it allows water surface slopes to exist, which is more realistic. It incorporates friction, and it allows for time-dependent travel of the water onto the marsh. So it's no longer just instantly through the back of the marsh. And one of the things with that, though, is it's validated at least at the time with a single creek. And furthermore, it's calibrated with a ratio of the in-channel and overbank velocities, but it's not dependent on local conditions of the main channels, kind of what Adrian was showing, that it's pretty dynamic in these larger channels. So that led us to 3 research questions. The first being, what is the in-channel behavior of velocities in multiple tidal creeks? So within a combined area, if you have multiple creeks, what does behavior look like? Number two, what are the sources and influences of effective and bed drag in tidal creeks, which might help explain any differences that we may see. And number three, what are potential mechanisms underlying creek connectivity and these kind of circulations, and how do they depend on the tidal phase? So first, this is a digital elevation model of the coast located on the southeast Atlantic coast, where you see the north of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And in the circle is our study site. And on Sapelo Island, at the very bottom, there's a marsh where we did our work, where that star is. And this is just showing a similar map at the top left and the top right, as you just saw. But at the bottom is a zoom of our specific site. So our site had three intertidal creeks that terminate in the marsh. And you can see there Creek 1, 2, and 3. A main channel, Dean Creek, and then you can see our instrument array. So we had pressure sensors at the creek heads that gets the water level, and at the creek mouths, we had acoustic Doppler velocimeters, which measure the flow and water level at the creek mouths. And just to note that flood is considered positive on the x-axis in the upcoming slides, and ebb going off the marsh is considered negative. Just a little more details on our study site. This is a digital elevation model from 2010 from NOAA on the top left. And just one of the key things to point out is that the low marshes here, you can see in this darker color. And along these creeks, you can see that they have higher elevation, they have internal levees. And then along the main channel, you have the largest levees here. In the bottom left, in panel B, on the x-axis is just the position and the y is the elevation. So this is the channel cross-section. And the key thing to note here is that the channel cross-section of Creek 3 is about twice as large as Creeks 1 and 2. And then lastly, this figure on the x-axis is showing tidal stage, and the y-axis is showing average depth. So how to interpret this is if you're at 0.5 meters above mean sea level, if you intersect that water level with this digital elevation model, you find the average elevation. So it goes down because as the water level increases, more of this area gets flooded. And then at some point, everything's flooded, so it only gets deeper. And these are just the instruments that we had used in the study. And so here are some results from the data itself. This is showing each line here is a continuous line. It's a tidal cycle. So we measured about 20 tidal cycles. So the x-axis is the streamwise velocity from the ADV. That's a mean velocity. So on the right-hand side, positive is flood. And then on the left-hand side, negative is ebb, so going off the marsh. And then you have the tidal stage here. And then the colors represent time relative to high water. So if the color is blue, that means it's before high water. And if it's red, it means it's after. So you would follow a single line here. The black dot represents high water. And then you would go down until the end where we have no data because the instrument's in air. And then if I show these two, which is Creeks 2 and 3 here, right away we can kind of see a pretty different pattern between the stage flow relationships of these three creeks. The first thing that we can kind of notice is that Creek 1 and 3 have a larger peak velocity, close to 1 meter per second on the ebb. And whereas Creek 2, the maximum is about 60 or 70 centimeters per second. And another key thing to note is during the flood tide that the Creek 2 on intermediate and spring tides continues to flow in even though it's at high water, whereas Creek 3 is reversing. So Creek 3, the water is exiting, and at the same time, Creek 2, it's entering. And this slide right here is kind of a summary of those results. So this is the ensemble average of the previous data, and it's split into these different groupings for high tide. So the first graph you see here is tidal stage. Those should be all the same, more or less. Then this is a summary of the previous slide, which we have the velocity shown as absolute value and the dashed line showing the flow reversal. So as you can see from left to right or from neap to spring, the flow reversal difference increases. And then along with that, we have the along channel slopes in each of the creeks. And you can notice here that the scale between these three changes. And lastly, what we have measured is a cross marsh slope from the creek head of Creek 1 and 3. You can see that we actually picked up a signal of a tilt across the marsh. So kind of a consequence of this more complicated flow pattern, especially because it wasn't necessarily anticipated, is on the x-axis of this graph is the net tidal transport. So if you integrate the stage, the flow area, and the velocity over the course of a tide, during the neap tide, it should be basically zero, which is expected, all the flows going through the channel. So there is some error because the instrument goes out of water. However, when you get to intermediate and spring tides, what you can see is that Creek 2 is flood positive, meaning that more water is entering through Creek 2 than exits, and Creeks 1 and 3 is flood negative, whereas more water is exiting through those. So with that, we were kind of curious about what could be a driving factor of that difference in just this small confined area. So this graph right here, what we did was we estimated the effective drag coefficient for Creeks 2 and 3. And the y-axis here is showing each dot is showing a value that we estimated. And the shaded area is a moving average plus a standard deviation. And so how you would read this graph, the top is being the flood and the bottom being the ebb. If you're in a tidal cycle, as the water level rises, it goes up. And then when the flow reverses at some point, you go down here and read this from right to left. So it forms a loop, but this way you can at least show kind of the raw data at the same time. And so what we can see is the large increase in drag during the flood for both these two creeks. And then although on the ebb, it's somewhat uncertain, they more or less converge on 0.02, but there is high uncertainty here. But the key takeaway from that is that the effective drag is about 3 to 12 times larger than the bottom drag. So here, this dashed line is showing the bottom drag value. And then the drag pattern between Creeks 2 and 3 are somewhat similar. And it's still insufficient to explain any kind of differences between the flow patterns. So with that, we were looking into two potential causes because we don't have measurements on the main creek, but this is a schematic showing the same exact site. So this is derived from aerial imagery. And it's kind of adapted from Torres et al. 2007 in a way. They have a nice schematic from their paper, but this bar is showing the surface tilt, the water surface tilt across the marsh during the flood, ebb, and late ebb. The arrows are showing the direction of inflow in the creeks. And then along this Dean Creek right here, DC, is showing the assumed flow direction of this main channel. And what led us to this is that the confluence of Creek 2 is on the apex of this bend in Dean Creek, which is quite sharp. The width to curvature ratio, I think, is 0.8. So with that, these red arrows show a kind of an assumed flow path where early in flood, there's not much influence of the bend. However, later in flood, the water is directed towards Creek 2, which can help explain the extended flooding. And then on the ebb, the flow would be directed into Creek 2, which would suppress the outflow. And there's two nice papers that show two mechanisms that might be explaining this. So the first being Cranenberg et al. 2019, which actually Adrian's a co-author on, but they have a nice field study of a tidal meander looking at the flow pattern around a bend. So these arrows are showing the flow at a given cross-section location, and these boxes with the numbers are showing the water surface elevation. So for 1.2 and 1.2 here, where my arrow is, what you can say from that is the water surface across the channel is flat. When you get to the apex of the bend, you have minus 1.2 and 2.0. So the water surface is tilted towards the inner bank, so it's higher on the outer bank. And then up here, you can see that it's tilted towards the right. So that's during the ebb, and then during the flood. You kind of have a similar pattern where on the flood, the apex of the bend, the outer bank is tilted upwards. So the flow would be preferential out to the outer bank, which is where Creek 2 is located. And there's kind of a second potential explanation, but again, we don't have the correct measurements. This is from another study, Finotello from 2020, where they did a nice field study. I think it's in Venice. But basically, they have the flow patterns around a sharp meander. So on the ebb in this left-hand side, you can see that the flow arrows basically on the ebb are directed into this tributary creek, which would be suppressing the outflow. And then on the flood, you can see that some portion of this main channel flow is directed towards the tributary, which would enhance the inflow. So during the flood, the inflow would be enhanced, and during the ebb, the outflow would be diminished. And that might explain what we're kind of seeing with our system in particular. And with that, there's just kind of a few key messages from this work. And number one being that the effective drag we found was 3 to 12 times greater than beg drag with these small intertidal creeks, which is important because the drag is often used as a parameter to tune models and calibrate and validate hydrodynamic models. So sometimes maybe things aren't being captured if you don't include the effects of, say, vegetation or things like that. Let's see. Within a confined drainage area, there's multiple creeks have pretty differing flooding and ebbing patterns. And not only that, they have an opposite net water and suspended transport direction within a small thing. So oftentimes in large scale models, to be computationally efficient, you have to make your grid size pretty large. But what this is showing is kind of within that grid cell, you can have different patterns, which might suggest that there's different kinds of evolution of the marsh. As Torres et al. Had shown before, that the tidal creeks, they're clearly regularly exchanging and interacting with one another on the marsh. And as I was saying, that these kind of opposing asymmetries and platform flows, they might give rise to heterogeneity in the geomorphic evolution. So the whole marsh platform might not be rising at the same exact rate. One part might be rising, another part might be sinking, and it's still, there's, I think, more detail to be figured out. And with that, just open it up for any questions. And I'd just like to thank all my co-authors, my lab members who really helped a ton with this work, and Jorge and Red Yaku for inviting us to speak. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much, Adrian and Colin. I'm very happy to see you both. It has been a long time since we were together there in Pittsburgh, and I can see, you went from being undergrad students and the second year that we interacted in the research group, and now you are almost a PhD and doing fantastic research, both of you. So I will maybe ask, since you are there, Colin, I will start a question for you. These little creeks, they go inland for a while, and they do have different platform configurations. For example, creek number 2, they have more meandering, and you mentioned that it's closer to the apex of the bend. So what controls the shape of the creeks? What basically, in terms of geomorphology, what do you think is controlling these scales? How far they go, and also the shape of the creeks?
Yeah, so I think if I'm understanding correctly, so For everybody on the Zoom, basically, I think what Jorge is saying, like this creek is a reticulated pattern. So it's kind of like a spidering web. Whereas here you have a single threaded meander creek, which is twice as long as Creek 1. And then clearly you have a pretty large branching structure here. And I I think a lot of it has to do with the geomorphology, but a lot of the work that my PhD advisor has done and other lab members is looked at the ecology of the system. And I something that still is like not totally determined, but the influence of the crabs that I showed earlier is quite significant. So if you go to this field site tomorrow, right now, if you go to Creek 1, what you'll find at the creek head at this kind of mud flat is hundreds and hundreds of Zarma. And when you step over to Creek 2, which I think is only about 100 meters away right here, you'll find barely. There's some background level of crabs, but what you'll find is really abundant mussel mounds. So all over the place, you'll have robust, these mounds that are about half a meter tall. They have really robust vegetation. And then when you go to Creek 3, you'll have a ton of crabs and a ton of mussels. So I think the ecology is super, super important. And that's, I think that's also very related to the flow, right? If you have a creek that has a higher input of TSS, like a particulate material, then the mussels are going to thrive there because they're filter feeders. And then if you have creeks with higher outflows near the creek head, which are more erosive, it's beneficial for the crabs because it can flush out their burrows as they dig, and it'll remove the sediment and the detrital material. So I think the ecology is a significant role.
Well, it looks very interesting to now mix, hydrology, geomorphology, and ecology, and they're pretty good examples. I'll get another question for you, Colin. When you plan field studies, in river, where I mostly have done my work, it's you go from low flows to high flows, and you try to measure 4 times in a year. When you plan your field study here, I know that tidal is one of the key parameters to measure, but for geomorphology or for the ecology, maybe longer timescales are needed. So how do you mix, timescales of the tidal with timescales of these, features like the geomorphology? How do you plan your field measurements?
Yeah, so that's a good question because in the summer, when we did our measurements in August, it's basically peak productivity of Spartina. So that's when you have the most robust vegetation. And what you would expect is a higher drag estimate, basically. So what I would anticipate, and I guess to your point, I think generally what you try to do is do a study for at least 15 days to do the spring and neap tidal cycle in the summer, and then one in the winter, and then potentially one in the spring to cover that seasonality effect that might not be reflected in that graph I showed, because in the winter, when the vegetation's not there, the drag might be shifted down entirely. If that's making sense, I can go to that graph too. Let me see. Yeah, so right here. So basically in the summer, maybe the true value is falling along this upper bounds. And then in the winter, it's this lower bounds because you're removing so much vegetation from that effect.
Perfect. It looks very, very interesting. And congratulations for your work, and I am really, really happy for you. So maybe allow me now to ask questions to Adrian. I do have a question here, Adrian. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Adrian, you have in the main channel, you have it's a meander bend, it's a bend basically, and then you have the creeks arriving in different places. And you have shown the longitudinal dispersion. How important is the mixing processes, but in three-dimensional point of view? Because I will assume the creeks, it's in themselves, they were coming, with a bend upstream, and then you have the main channel, with a bend. How important is to understand the three-dimensional structure of those?
That's a great question, and it's a very, I would say, what I'm finding more and more as I study the system is actually the morphology is one of the most important factors in determining the mixing processes and ultimately the dispersion. But also, in another way to say it, the morphology sets the circulation patterns of the estuary. And I think it's a great point to bring up because lots of sort of classical estuarine theory and also river theory looks at a rectangular channel, and it's strongly based on that. But as I'm sure you're well aware, once you have meanders, once you have bed forms, constrictions, and all of these other topographic features, it completely shifts what's going on. And you really have to look at these localized flow structures to understand, the broader system. And so, for example, I mentioned that the creeks get really stratified, and it comes out of the creeks really stratified. It goes into the main channel, but you go 500 meters downstream, and now you're well mixed again. And so a big part of that is the fact that the main channel has a meandering planform, and because of the secondary circulation, you get sort of an enhanced mixing. And so all the stratification occurs in the creeks because it has weaker currents, so the mixing is and because of the stronger salinity gradient, which drives it, kind of like a lock exchange type of circulation. But so it sort of water goes into the creeks as well mixed, it gets stratified in the creeks, and then it comes back into the main channel, where it eventually gets mixed. And so it's really important to consider all the, when we say the water, it passes through all of these different systems and all of these different morphologic features, and each of them plays a role. So I don't know if I really answered your question. I guess I sort of provided more of a comment, but I guess I would just end it that the morphology matters a lot, and especially in these tidal systems where the tidal currents interact with bathymetry in a really intricate and sometimes complicated way. And so you have to be careful when you do things like tidal averaging, because you sometimes lose features which are occurring at much shorter timescales.
Yeah, you're right. And this is, again, congratulations, Adrian. You mentioned that dispersion that you obtain is larger than the theory predicted. And I was wondering if that is due to these complex flow structures that are happening also there, because, if you have a main channel, a straight main channel, and creeks that are just coming like a straight channels, that would be like a basal or like a base case. But here you have a geomorphology that is a little bit more complex, and that induces mixing and dispersion and so on. So that's why I was maybe wondering myself if that dispersion also comes higher because of that configuration. I don't know. Yeah, but it's interesting. It's very, 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 very key. So the same for you, Adrian. Again, this is a question. There are a lot of students here from Peru that maybe are wondering, what is next for you? You're almost finishing your PhD, you're publishing papers. So what intrigues you later? What are you going to do research? What do you see yourself for the next years in terms of scientific research?
That's a great question. Tomorrow I'm going into the field to deploy some instruments. So we're doing another field campaign in the same estuary, but doing looking at we're looking at dispersion near the mouth and some bridge constrictions. But for the future, I think it's I'd certainly would like to continue progressing the scientific field. I'm also quite interested in some also doing some applied research, which would, I really appreciate and enjoy doing the fundamental science, but as a, training as an engineer under many others that who have taught me, I also have this a calling to try to pursue some applied research, and it's one of the things I'm interested in is how can I use my knowledge of coastal circulation, coastal currents, and stratification, density effects, and mixing. How can I use that to inform biogeochemical processes? How can I use that to inform, restoration projects, or, how do these currents interact with aquaculture, for example? So, these are just like different types of applications which sort of require a knowledge of what are the currents doing. I'm definitely interested in sort of pursuing some topics which span in that realm.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. Colin, Adrian, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jorge, for having us. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you, Jorge.
Muchas gracias a todos los que participaron en el evento. Bueno, vamos a tener la grabación disponible en YouTube. Dame un segundo. Okay. Entonces vamos a tener la grabación disponible en YouTube en los siguientes días. Y quisiera aprovechar en comentarles que el siguiente mes y en noviembre también vamos a tener inicio a nuestros cursos virtuales en morfometría y también en modelamiento. El curso de modelamiento va a ser dirigido, va a estar a cargo del doctor Alejandro Mendoza y del doctor Jorge Abad, y va a dar inicio el 11 de octubre. Las inscripciones están abiertas. También tenemos el curso para quienes estén interesados en detección aplicada a caracterización morfodinámica de ríos. El curso comenzará el 15 de noviembre. Y estará a cargo también del doctor Jorge y también del doctor Domínguez. Ambos son especialistas con una amplia experiencia en caracterización geomorfológica. Entonces los esperamos para las siguientes actividades. Muchas gracias nuevamente a los ponentes. Thank you so much, Adrian and Colin. It was very nice to know you about your research. Jorge told me a lot about you, and so I guess he's proud to have you here. Well, it's very pleasure to have you in this webinar. Hope you can join us in the following activities we will organize in Reyacu, in Peru, and maybe we can coordinate something in the States. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gracias a todos. Con esto damos finalizado el webinar.